this conversation is going to be based largely on Simon's PhD research. So, I'm going to let him kind of drive things a bit. For the attendees, feel free to shoot in questions anytime. The easiest way to do that is through the question and answer application. We're better able to track those things than if you put them in the chat, because sometimes stuff can get a little bit lost if there's a few scrolls. But otherwise, where do you want to start off, Simon?
Yeah, Mark, good to actually get to talk to you in person. I guess you're getting a lot of that. I saw your chat with Lauren the other day as well. So good to virtually meet you. And again, John, thanks for sort of facilitating this in these bizarre times we find ourselves in. I guess it's just sort of, I want to get both of you guys' insight and ideas, because obviously you both coached a while and you're coaching at good levels. And basically the background for me, I guess, was there's a lot of things going on in UK sport at the moment around mental health, particularly around athletes and dealing with the stress of trying to perform at Olympic Games, World Championships and stuff like that. And it's got to the stage where UK sport are actually have a mental health programme in place to try and help athletes. And it's pretty comprehensive, and it tries to, do the best for them. But nowhere does it really talk about the coaches' mental welfare. And a couple of years ago, I was working at a college, university, and for the first time, I think ever, and again, this is probably linked to your point with Lauren, Mark, this idea of I just love volleyball and I like doing volleyball. For the first time, I really wasn't enjoying it, and I couldn't wait to get away from the gym. I wasn't enjoying the athletes. I wasn't enjoying the process. And in hindsight, I was burning out, and I was having a problem with motivation, and I felt isolated and all this sort of stuff. And in hindsight, I was kind of like, well, what was the process that was going on there? And I didn't understand it at the time. And I got recruited to try and do a PhD, and it was something that was personal, it was something that was interesting. And I wanted, because I've got a coach education background, I wanted to sort of work out a way where we could identify what stress was and the mental health issues, and then try and put something in coach education that can prepare coaches better to understand, what stress is, and how to deal with it and how to recognise it. So that's kind of a bit about the background and sort of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying not to talk too much because I want it to be a conversation, but that's kind of a sort of baseline of where I'm at the moment, I guess. So
we could start off with why Mark smiled so much when you talked about not wanting to go to the gym. What was that all about, Mark?
I've been coaching for a long time. I've had lots of those days.
Okay.
and this and the sort of research that I've done so far, the reason you're coping and able to bounce back from that, Mark, is probably linked to things, and again, it's going back to Lauren's conversation, the fact that your wife has no interest in volleyball and you're able to separate your work life from your home life. And that gives you an opportunity to recover and sort of put volleyball aside and deal with family matters. And there's this thing, it's called work-home interference. This is the sort of theory behind it. And there's a high correlation where you're able to put away the volleyball side of things and focus on family life and recover mentally, emotionally, physically. You're able to have more longevity in the sport, and then the problems that come, I guess, when you start bringing work back to the house and it starts to interrupt the sort of relationships you've got there.
Well, okay, Mark, you're a test case of sort, because you were obviously coaching before you got married. You've been coaching since you got married. You've been coaching since you've now had a son for the last 6 years. Can you recognize a shift from pre-marriage to family life?
There's a much greater possibility of distraction, I guess. But my wife, the last period when I haven't been working, she said she notices there's a difference between when I'm not working and when I'm working. So the phrase that she used was something along the lines of "welcome back" or "now you're home, you haven't been before." So the idea when you're coaching, it's always there, and that's one of the differences, one of the basic differences between being a player and a coach, I think, is that part of it. You're never not coaching. You're never not doing something. At least I'm not. So it's you have some distraction. You have the child is probably a greater distraction than the wife, and just because when you start to play with the kid, you actually enter into his world, and you have to be fully in his world. So it's much it's a greater interference, to use the terminology. So that's just from my perspective. But it's there's a whole lot of interesting things around it. I thought a lot about it because I had some difficult times in the recent past, and there's never been a point when I didn't like volleyball, which is one of the and in a sense there's never been a point where I didn't like coaching volleyball. The stresses are the other things that get in the way of that.
So it's that awesome point. And I guess the next sort of stage building on that is this idea that as a coach, you've got to balance a whole lot of stuff. And a lot of the research points to this idea of organizational stress and situational stress. So this is this idea where working for a national government body or a professional club or whatever, you've got to, I guess it's this notion of coaches and middle managers. You manage from the middle. You've got to look after the needs and wants of the club or the organisation, and you've got to look after the needs and wants of the athletes. And the organisational stress, you might not have a big enough budget. You might be under pressures from the sporting director to get results or finish in a certain place in the league, qualify for a European Championship, an Olympic Games, whatever. That comes with a level of stress. And at the same time, you've got to manage players that are maybe injured, aren't getting enough court time, unsure of their role within the team. And this just builds and builds and builds. And this is the tough bit for a coach, I guess, is being able to balance both sides, the organisational stuff and the day-to-day running of the team. So do you have any sort of immediate thoughts on that, or any examples where there's maybe been a clash? Or
my best guess is that coaches feel the stresses or the pressures in different areas depending on themselves and their particular interests and personality and so forth. For me, probably the biggest cause of stress are some outside influences, although maybe less than some other people in terms of the spectators or fans or club or whatever. And that stuff can get to me, but I'm also pretty good at ignoring it to some point. The personally, the biggest stress for me is the interpersonal stuff. That's the thing. The managing the relationships is probably the biggest stress for me. So I actually worked out probably only 3 or 4 years ago that the actual single biggest stress that I have in the course of a week is choosing the starting lineup. So, and the reason
I don't think that's unique.
Yeah, but the reason is that with some very few exceptions, I want everybody to play. I want everybody to feel good and part of the team. I want everybody to be playing well and contributing, and I don't want to have to choose between. I want to say my children, but because that might be slightly overstretching. But there's a kind of element of that, and I don't like to be. I don't want to. I want to disappoint them or put them into that position where they can be disappointed. So the time leading up to that decision is actually the most stressful time of the week for me. And then afterwards, it's okay, and the game is the game, and having a screaming fans or irrational president or something is actually relatively minor concern afterwards.
So there's a couple of interesting points there. There's a researcher here in the UK. Her name's Sophia Jowett. She works at Loughborough University. She does a lot of research into coach-athlete relationship, and it's linked with essentially self-determination theory. So it's trying to create autonomous athletes that feel a sense of relatedness to you as the coach and are bought into the sort of shared goals and values of the team and the organisation and stuff like that. And it's amazing that as coaches we put so much energy into try to develop these relationships, and I like to draw comparisons from other sports where we see in football, soccer for you, John, that you often hear that the coaches lost the dressing room, or the agents are telling players that they have to move away and stuff like that. And from a coaching point of view, ultimately a lot of these things are out of your control. If a player wants to leave, they're going to leave. And if a player's unhappy, then they're going to be talking to their agent, who's then going to be putting pressure on presidents. And I say anecdotally, I hear of players around Europe that they don't go to the coach, they go to the president or the sports chief and say, this needs to change, the coach needs to change, I need to play more, or I leave. And
are you still talking about football here? Are you still talking about football?
No, this is volleyball, basketball, football. It's anecdotal, but I think you don't agree.
It's not anecdotal.
Okay.
It's anecdotal in the sense that I've never been in the room when the coach is when the player's talking to the president. But okay, I don't have first-hand knowledge of those conversations because I'm deliberately excluded, or explicitly excluded. But yes, those conversations happen all the time.
So how do you deal with that, and how does that sort of make you feel when you're trying to harbour these relationships with people?
It's difficult. It's difficult to kind of rationalise it, but I've never had really serious ones of that. So I mean, I know of situations where I've had players talk to the president, and but mostly in my case, it hasn't been too bad. Like I don't think I've ever had the me or him scenario presented to the president. But I know of plenty of situations where things like that happen, or some versions, and it's
so that might be a testament to the fact that you invest in good relationships with your athletes. So there's an element of trust and respect there. I'm maybe bigging you up there, but but based on what you've talked about,
I'd like to think so, but I mean, I would be lying, and so would every other coach who ever said that he had always had good relations with everybody in his team. So
yeah,
there's always two guys in the team who you, for whatever reason, you just don't get on with in the same way that you do with others. So it's just, you just don't have anything to talk to them about, or you come from a different generation, or there's dozens of reasons. God just doesn't have a sense of humor, so I don't want to talk to him.
So just on that generational point, how have you sort of embraced the younger athletes, previous generation, the more recent generation athletes with like technology and, social media and stuff like that? Because you've obviously embraced it as a coach.
Only up to a point. So, I mean, Twitter, Facebook, and blogs are old man's things. So, I don't know that, at some point it was cutting edge, but mostly my main response to most things is to make fun of them, and that's just me and my personality as much as anything else, but then at the same time don't take it particularly seriously.
Fair enough. Maybe this is the Australian outlook. It's quite laid back. It's just, again, it's interesting that from an example of football, where you see that a lot of coaches are trying to ban mobile phones from the training room and the practice facilities and stuff like that, and the players have to actually drop their phones off until they're leaving the facility, which is I don't have phones inside the practice gym or in the weights room. So that part's pretty simple, and meetings and meals, so then they have to be off. So I don't mind them using phones at meals, but they have to be turned off so they don't make noises. But often I find that they still interact with each other. Most often they still interact with each other. It's just that they interact with each other about what they're just looking at, and they're sharing stuff, so it's not. I don't find it in my teams anyway as bad as some horror stories of people just completely blocking off the outside world.
To that point, I'm thinking that you've, in a way, at least you've addressed this question before, Mark, about there's certain things that if you put a spotlight on them, you'll make them a bigger deal than there would be if you kind of let them alone. And rules is part of that, and it's kind of a wooden thing as well, where there's certain things. If you put a rule in about it, you're going to encourage players to break it, and then it becomes an issue when it really didn't need to be an issue.
I very strongly believe in that, and I had conversations with this about that topic with Anastasi, and Anastasi said that when he doesn't have that many rules, and he said that when he was a player, the first thing that he did was look at the rules so that he knew what to do, as in to break the rules. That was his goal. And I've heard, like with the Polish national team, and the change from De Giorgi to Vital Heinen, they went from having a lot of rules to virtually none. And one of the big ones was that they ate dinner in training camp and they weren't allowed to go out from training camp. So they always went out. So it was a sort of a daily fight. De Giorgi watching who was eating or not really eating and making them eat if he thought they were about to go out, and a whole bunch of bullshit. And when Vital said they didn't have to have a curfew, or they had to have a curfew, but it was 11 o'clock or whatever, you can go out to dinner. They sat around in their room. They sat around and said, well, what are we going to do now? And they stayed in camp. They ate dinner in the restaurant and stayed in their rooms and played video games.
Did Vital expect that response, or was he not even thinking that?
No, my guess is that Vital didn't even pay any attention to it. It wasn't even of interest to him.
Okay, gotcha.
So.
All right. I don't know if we want to get to the question from John just yet.
Okay, I mean, I've got some. I guess I just wanted to sort of talk about a bit more about the theory, I guess, and sort of get your thoughts
sure.
on it. And this is to both of you, I guess, is what is stress and what does it mean to you guys?
You're causing me stress right now. I was actually just thinking about it a little while ago, remembering when I was assistant coach at Brown and the kind of stresses that I kind of felt like I was experiencing. There was game day stress during the match, which admittedly for an assistant coach is a different perspective than it is for a head coach. But I remember quite explicitly that at that time, I allowed myself to become very emotionally engaged with what was going on the court. I wasn't projecting it. You couldn't, if you looked at me, my exterior was pretty calm, but internally it was affecting me a lot. Frustration if we were playing well, that sort of thing. And you could, if you were really paying attention, you could see it in the color of my face, because apparently my face would get really red, but you couldn't otherwise see it. And the head coach even commented it on it at one point, more to the positive, like, well, I'm glad you're not screaming and yelling and doing anything crazy like that. But I got to the point where, I decided, because you're allowed to in the NCAA, I was going to stand up down at the end of the bench, and making that adjustment, allowing me just that little bit of pacing that you tend to do when you're standing, bled off quite a bit of that tension and that stress. And so that was kind of one way of dealing with that side of things. And over the years, I've continued that, but I also think I'm less emotionally invested in what's, the play-by-play than I was before. On the other side, it was more, organizational. And I'm not so sure I've gotten rid of this side of it. It's just dealing with the crap that comes down from outside the team, administrators, the club, whatever structure you happen to be in. Because the stuff that you get sometimes, and inexplicable decisions, and I can generally deal with a lot and be pretty laid back, but when I'm faced with just stupidity, that tends to set me off a little bit. So there were definitely a few times where I was like, yeah, I will quit this job because these people are idiots. I haven't experienced that a lot recent years, but every once in a while something stupid happens. You're just like, really, come on. Why do I have to work with morons? Not naming any names.
You should get out of the house more. I'm sure it happens to me every day. Not right now, obviously, but...
So I guess from a theory point of view, is basically there's this idea of transactional model of stress, and it's basically the relationship between a person and the environment, and it's how the person appraises the perceived threat and their ability to resource that threat. So I guess in layman's terms is if you, in your environment, you'll make an assessment, is this taxing my resources to be able to cope, and is it going to be a positive or a negative thing? And that's how the transaction works. Because I guess ultimately stress doesn't always have to be negative. And you've got things like the inverted U theory, where you have to have a degree of stress to be able to function. And it's quite interesting. Most people procrastinate to a certain degree until they have to have that hard deadline, and they need that stress to be able to get the task over the line or whatever. So it's quite interesting from that point of view. The other thing is there should be a distinction drawn between stressors and strain. So the stressors are the environmental demands, but the strain is the negative effect of those demands. And it's where the stressors become a strain that you start to maybe experience things like burnout and a poor relationship with what you're doing. And I think
physical responses, yeah.
Yeah, it's psychological, physical, and behavioural. So it's quite interesting. And I guess all of this, and it goes to one of Mark's first points, is this idea of motivation and your relationship with the job or the team or whatever. And if you're able to remain motivated, then a lot of the nonsense and the bullshit doesn't really come into it, because you've got the goal, you've got the task, and you're going to put up with a lot of stuff to be able to achieve. And that, I guess that's another theory. But thoughts on any of that?
Where does I didn't mention this before, but where does job security stress come into it?
Brilliant question. So the whole, I missed it out in my sort of introduction. Most of this came from a discussion with my brother. He's a professional golfer, and we were talking about the fact that Premier League managers, I think it's 1.5 years is the expected lifespan of a Premier League manager. I can maybe find it. It might be less than that. We'll say 1.5. And
doesn't matter.
Yeah, but no. In that 1.5 years, they're multi-millionaires. So, and the fact that they've worked in the Premier League probably means they're going to get another job relatively quickly. It might be a step down, it might be in another country, but if you get to that level, you're secure. So are you that worried about losing your job? But Mourinho apparently is taking in more than £20 million in payoffs. Is that a stress to him, or is it just the fact that his ego's taking the hit that he's been fired? And this is the thing. So my brother was adamant that financially they don't care, so they're not under stress. I'm of the sort of different view that you invest your heart and soul into a project, and you've got your ego attached to it. You've invested a lot. You've maybe you've up and moved your family and stuff like that, and you've got a lot riding on the success. And I would say, like, my experience going to the US and going to Sweden, financially, if I'd been fired, I was unemployed for 6 months when I came back to the UK after being in the States. It's not good. But when you get to sort of higher levels, and if you're a Serbian coach and an Italian coach, chances are you're going to get your pick of teams. If you're a successful Italian or Serbian coach, you're going to get your pick of teams because the schools of volleyball are so well respected. So
I'd say you have more flexibility, but
yeah, of course. I'm not dealing in absolutes, Mark. It's just I'm generalising to a certain extent. But you do see that and Joel Banks is one of my good friends. He's spent a lot of time developing his resume, and he's worked really hard, and he's the opportunity to work with good coaches, and he's really, really worked, and he's been successful. But as a British coach, is pretty tough, and he's quite open in saying that, because the Brits don't know anything about volleyball. Yeah, well, you can make the same point. Yeah, absolutely. But it's just interesting, and I don't know what your thoughts are, Mark.
The interesting thing on that topic, on that part of the topic for me is, so there are a whole lot of, so there's a lot of strains, as you put it, in coaching, things that negatively affect you. And maybe fear of job security is the one that can or can lead you to the path to make decisions that you're uncomfortable with. So that's any
given Sunday, the doctor and the drugs in any given Sunday.
Well, when that particular strain leads you to thinking about making decisions that will help you save your job rather than doing the best thing for the team. So are there differences? Do different strains lead to different responses?
Well, you got to mention right now, Coach's hat trick.
Well, yeah, that's one.
I mean, it's one of your favorite things, bits of advice to all coaches. You specifically said it the other day. Make sure you do everything people expect you to do, whether you should do it or not.
The pressure to do what you're expected to do, to play the play you're expected to play, to make this substitution, might take that time out. And now that you brought it up, I actually wrote about it very explicitly, that's the biggest pressure that you have, is to do the thing that you're expected to do, even to train in a particular way, and to respond to different situations in a particular way. They're all it's a big part of the pressure that you actually have.
We could probably have a whole long discussion on all of the perceptions of what coaching looks like, what good coaching looks like, based on films and TV and books and everything like that.
Mark, does that lend itself to this idea you talked about with Lauren again, about this, it's all a show and it's all an act? And does that sort of protect you from some of the stress and strain?
No, and that is probably the exact thing that leads the interpersonal stuff that I was talking about. So is all of the little shows and the little acts that go into every day's work environment, that those are the things that build up and stress me out.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would think that it does have to build up being something that is not completely you, because you have to, at times you have to sacrifice little pieces to be able to connect with somebody in a way that you need to connect with them in the moment. Like, for example, you may not be a cheerleader coach, but in a particular match or with a particular group of players, you may need to be more of that than your natural inclination would be, which could, if it happens once, okay, maybe it's not a big deal. If it's something that you have to do over the course of a season, it could probably take an accumulation toll.
You have to tap into that part of you, because you still have to be authentic. So you can't turn into somebody else, but you pick and emphasize different parts of your personality, different parts of your skill set at different times. So that's not exactly the same. So you still can't be anybody else but yourself.
Awesome. I totally agree. Can I just want to, so it's kind of moving things into motivation. I just want to quickly show, it's a minute video clip. I'm hopefully it won't be copyrighted or anything like that, but hopefully you've heard him. It's Brett Ledbetter, and he's got the website What Drives Winning. There's lots of really good interviews and stuff like that, and examples from coaches in America. And I just want to show this sort of thing because it talks about motivation, and I want to get your thoughts on how this resonates and if it applies or not. So 2 secs. Right. Right.
Okay, question. Are we getting audio? Mark, are you hearing anything?
I don't have any audio.
All right. Hold on.
No, I think that I'm wondering if that might be a limitation to this.
All right. Okay. You can see the picture, yeah?
Yeah, we can see the picture.
Right.
Sure.
Okay. So I recommend if you're watching this or listening to this, you check this out. It's a case study with Urban Meyer from What Drives Winning. So it's not the end of the world. So basically, Jim Carrey comes out and he talks about how he's not just anybody. He's a 2-time Golden Globe winner, and how important it is that he's a 2-time Golden Globe winner. But when he goes to bed at night, he dreams of being a 3-time Golden Globe winner, because that will complete him and that will make him more of a person. And it's funny, but at the same time, it's this notion of, chasing the prize. And, at the end of the day, does it actually change anything? Does it change you as an individual? Does it change perceptions of you? Does it make you feel better? And what happens the next day after the championship or the important win? Well, we go back to work and we start preparing for the next game. And it kind of resonated with me because when I was coming up as a coach, when I was building the project in Leeds, I won my first ever coaching championship, and I never celebrated it because at the weekend we had an important game and another competition. And then Bill Walsh talks about, and the score will take care of itself. If you don't celebrate your victories and you give yourself a hard time when you lose, how can you ever get ahead, and how can you ever take care of yourself mentally? Because you're always in negative points, I guess. And it really struck a chord with me, because you fight and you strive and you've got all these goals and aspirations, but at the end of the day, the next day, nobody's talking about it, and you're in search of the next and the next and the next, and it almost becomes like
like an addiction.
Yeah, you're always striving for the next thing, and you never really take time to celebrate what you've achieved or the process to get there. So I thoroughly recommend the video and the website. I think it's quite good. But anyway, your thoughts on my ramblings?
There are... there's a moment, everybody's different, and everybody has their own motivations, and probably a lot of coaches, it's probably, I shouldn't generalize, it's a lot of people that want to achieve things to validate their own sense of self, and that's a really specific thing. So that a person who has that kind of motivation, ambition, can never be satisfied if they're if their sense of self comes from the result of a game, then they can't ever be satisfied. But you should always celebrate your victories. So that's absolutely the bottom line. And it's when you're in a situation where victories aren't celebrated, then that's actually a really tough place to be. That's a really different kind of pressure, and that actually really leaves you nowhere to go. So then you start to get, then performance starts to be a really big thing. So you can win everything and be constantly unhappy and upset. So you have to celebrate victories, but they never stay for very long. And I can't say that I go straight on to the next thing. I normally take a few days. After a good celebration, you need a couple of days. But you do tend to move on to things pretty fast, probably faster than players. It's just the nature of it's partly the nature of the beast. And for me, it's a little bit my personality is just to get on with the next thing, whatever the next thing is.
Yeah.
It helps dealing with lack of success.
Yeah, because that's the other side of the equation. You have to be prepared and able to do both.
Yeah.
You're not going to win every single one, so you got to deal with the other side. On the motivation front, a question that I'll throw at you guys is your thoughts on the supposed power of the motivation against losing. There's this perception that hating to lose is the thing that drives people to be winners.
It's not what drives me, so I can't really talk about it. I have to say that that in my career I haven't met many people who have a really strong who are really super competitive. So that kind of win at all costs, whatever. So I think it's one of the myths of professional sport is that all the people who play it are super competitive and borderline sociopathic, if not psychotic. But it's actually not true. The professional sport is full of people like every other field. Some people want to be good. Some people want to get through the day. Some people want to make a bit more money. Some people, want some girls, whatever the motivation is. But there are very few people who have that really burning desire either to win or to not lose. And so I don't have much experience with the ones who hate to lose as opposed to really want to win.
Yeah, I think that it's losing's inevitable. So I remember when I was young, I had to win everything. But it puts you under so much pressure because it's inevitable you're going to lose. So ultimately it's going to hurt your performance if you're only focused on the result. And I think as I sort of moved into coaching, I think the process becomes much more powerful than the actual wins and losses. And you can't. What's that?
I have to win. I'm not one of those people not competitive, by the way.
No, I'm the same. But at the same time, if you're setting up and it's all about the win, then you're compromising the coach-athlete relationship stuff that you've talked about. You're maybe compromising ethics. You're maybe compromising your own health. you're maybe compromising, and I read one of your blog posts, the coach is responsible for 95% of injuries, then you're compromising the welfare of your athletes. And so then the process has to be sacrosanct, and you have to be able to. I think I've got a quote somewhere from Hugh McCutcheon. It's I'm going to bastardize it. It's something along the lines of process then results. So it's take care of the processes, and then the results take care of themselves. And it's the dog. My wife's just coming back in. So it's this idea of you get the processes right, then you're going to win more than you're going to lose. And then that you're still able to take care of the welfare and the sort of humanistic side of things. And that's kind of where I come at it.
That's fair.
Let me ask Simon. Let me ask you something about your experience in Sweden, if you're willing to share it, because you once talked about the perspective that you were overly competitive.
Yeah, I think, like, from a cultural thing in Sweden, I'd worked the whole season, and it was the last home game of the season. I got talking to the other coach, and he was talking about how it was hard in Sweden to get girls in particular to be competitive, because in the culture it's all about the team and sort of caring and nurturing for each other and putting the team before the individual. And that's why in Sweden they bring in quite a lot of Americans to sort of temper that and bring in that competitive edge. And I'd been coaching the whole season that it was about we have to win. And in hindsight, and I was going to say it, basically I had ran the whole season being scared that I was going to be fired, because it was my first professional outside of the UK gig. And I was worried I was getting fired every week, because we were a weak team. We were at the bottom half of the table. And every week after we've lost, and I've got to speak to the sports chief, I'm thinking he's going to pull the trigger and I'm gone. And it didn't. And I signed my own death warrant, I guess, because I went, and you mentioned this earlier, Matt, I went after the star player in one game because she was continuing to hit line, and it was against Nicole Koolhaas, who's now doing very well with the Dutch national team. She's in Turkey. But she kept trying to hit line against her, and she kept getting housed. And I lost my mind, and that kind of sealed that they wouldn't take me back, because I went after the star player. And but I still stand by it. She shouldn't be hitting line.
You have to. The wrong response in that situation is to not say it, because it's the one that will get you into trouble. And that's the one about, I guess, you touched on it about, what your standards are and ethics and so on, and those are the things that you can't compromise, and how you want to run the team and how you expect to do things, and the relationships you want to have with people, you can't compromise those. And it's also a point of reference. So, you when you get to that point, when the president's on your case or whatever, you say, well, actually, this is what I'm going to do, and that's, whatever happens. But, I worked out quite early in the coaching piece that in the end of the day, the mirror only has one person looking at me. So I have to look at myself in the mirror, and that's all. And that doesn't help with stress, but maybe it helps living with the consequences. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I then, seeing as how we're being honest and open, Mark, can you give a bit of insight into your sort of thoughts and emotions and levels of stress during the Qatar game for the Olympic qualifiers? The reason I ask, because again, like I watched it and I was surprised at particularly the first set. I was surprised at the result, and the dynamic in the second set when you were up big and then they came back. But you talked about consistency again with Lauren the other day, and I think in the most there was a couple of times where maybe the mask slipped slightly and your frustration came through, but you were on message a lot of the time in the timeouts you heard, and you were, reinforcing the match plan and stuff like that. So it's just from a stress point of view, what were your thoughts?
Well, it was a stressful moment because that was the game. That was all of it. But the decision that we made, or that I made over the course of the time with the team, was that in games I had to be a certain way. I had to react in a certain way to get the best performance from them. So, and what had caused problems or what wasn't effective or didn't seem to be effective was for me to lose my shit. So at that time, and that served us really well in the previous tournament. So when we had some really super stressful situations at Asian Championships, and that was what, I don't know, I can't say that for sure, of course, but what got us through that tournament successfully. So when we came to the moment when it didn't look like it was working out, which was really early in the match, and I had a little bit of a go, and I didn't get any response. So I didn't, or not an immediate response that I could notice. Then all right, I have to keep going with the thing that we've done and the way that we've done it up until now. Of course, history tells us that it didn't work, or at least, whether anything would have worked is the question that I'll probably ponder for another few years. But that was what was going on in that moment. Now, when you have that kind of emotion and stress, and you've decided on a particular response that is one of hiding all emotion and stress, then that has its own negative effects. So it's really tough to keep that level of control over yourself and the staff, and keep everything moving what would hopefully be forward that turned out not to be. So
it was really interesting. Thanks. And then just on that, so the sort of grieving point, and it almost feels like grief in that sort of situation. How do you cope and how do you bounce back from that? And not necessarily that game, but serious setbacks in general.
I touched on this before. My response is to keep going, just to keep moving forward. It's something that I talk about with my team actually really often in the course of the season, particularly, is that what happens doesn't matter. It happened, and you can't do anything about it. And what decides winners from losers in a course of a season is how they respond to the little setbacks that happen to everybody, or the little situations. So, but that's also the way that I live my life, in personal disappointments, personal tragedies, and so on. The only thing you can do is go back and do the next day, and the next day after that, and in a team try to be a little bit better, and as a coach analyse what went on, as best you can, figure out what happened, what you could have done differently, what were various options that were available or not available. You have to be rational about that and then put it in the toolbox and get on with it.
So it sounds like you're very process-driven then, as opposed to results, even though you're in an industry and a level where you have to win.
Okay.
I was going to say it sounds like it's more about kind of being in the moment from kind of the mental training level that we do with the players, or some coaches do with the players, which was the topic of last night's discussion with Dan Mickle, was teaching them to be in the now, not thinking about that the last play, last match, the date they had last night, whatever it is. It's conceptually a similar sort of idea.
Yeah, that sounds fair.
Related to this, I had an email from Rodrigo Barroso who asked, he's got a couple of things in here, but we're kind of talking about stress management. He actually asked more on a micro level, when you're dealing with something that's not working in the moment, players are not performing well, maybe there's some bad communication, something is going on now that's causing you stress. Are there coping mechanisms that you employ? And Simon, is there anything in the literature or whatever that you've seen that people can find useful in that regard?
Well, I guess there's this thing called naturalistic decision making, and it's basically, from a coaching point of view, is you're building up cues and patterns over time that you recognise that things are going to happen, or if A happens, then B will happen, then C will happen. And the more experience you are as a coach, the easier it is for you to pick up on those cues. So like an example, probably all of us, we can tell in a warm-up whether the players are on it, if there's a good energy and they're talking and having good conversations, if there's energy in what they're doing, or if it's flat. And then if you can recognise that, you might be able to circumvent things as the game goes on, that the energy's low and all this sort of stuff. So you're able to, based on your experiences and your body of work, I guess, pick up on things. And it's almost like a toolbox of skills. Now, a lot of that will happen subconsciously. You won't be aware at the moment that you'll see something or feel something that will then sort of trigger an action or a response. But if you ask coaches about it, it's hard for them to put a finger on it. And I guess the top level coaches are able to verbalise that, vocalise that, and sort of have a clear strategy behind that. If A is happening, then B will happen, and then I'll make an intervention. And I don't know, this might be a tenuous link, but the likes of John Sparrow will always take a timeout after the second point. If he doesn't like runs getting to 3 points. So he recognises something there. I'm going to try and do that. I know that flies in the face of your timeout, but I had to get that in somewhere.
There's another coach I know who does that.
So that's maybe for their own benefit. Is an opportunity for them to interject and get reinforced things. And then I guess crucially, I think it comes down, from a match point of view, it comes down to preparation. If you're well prepared, you've done the work in the gym, you've got a good match plan, you trust your players, then it will work out. Now, you might be mismatched, you might be playing a better team, but that's, again, where the process comes in. If the processes are right, then you're going to pick up the wins. And I guess ultimately it's this idea of not being tied in with the result. It doesn't define you. You win one week, you're a great coach. You lose the next week, you're a shit coach. That doesn't tie, as far as I'm concerned.
But what you described sounds to me like managing the game rather than managing stress. Or you manage stress by managing the game well. Is that the...
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I mean, my internal dialogue. Nobody ever wants to hear my internal dialogue when I'm coaching. It's an absolute car crash. But I try
I
not
wouldn't
to.
even understand it.
So it's really. You raised the point earlier, John. It's this idea of staying in the moment and, you know, one point at a time, and, you know, having processes in play for me. And maybe that's game management. Away from the sport, I think the strategies for dealing with stress are more important, like having a good opportunity to recover from volleyball. What do you do in the off season? What do you do between tournaments? What do you do? Are you in season? Are you working 20 hours a week? 20 hours a day? Or are you giving yourself time? And the part of that Urban Meyer video, if for people that will watch it, he talks about how he sets time aside. In the morning, he was religious, so in the morning he would have Bible study. At lunchtime, he would make sure he was taking care of his own fitness. And then at night time, it was all about the family, and there was no talk about sport, or his sport's American football. There was clear, distinct times where it was for him and his own mental welfare.
Yeah.
All right.
I have one.
Okay, good.
I have one thing that I've been thinking about on the general topic with coaches in particular, is that coaching is a stressful activity. It's a stressful profession, and you can make the argument that the ability to cope with stress is actually the defining characteristic of a good coach. And one of the characteristics of coping with stress is to not let it be visible, not let it be noticeable, not let it be in the open. And so whether coaches who are under stress, or whether coaches, because they're all under stress, whether coaches would ever admit to being stressed in or under pressure in this context that you were talking about. Do you follow that?
Say the last bit again, I'm not sure.
So it's a competitive advantage to cope with stress for a coach. And so to admit to stress in any way, shape or form, especially publicly, is giving up that competitive advantage.
And this will probably be where I struggle with my research, because I'm about to try and interview guys that are preparing for the Olympics and try and get them to open up about some of the stressful processes. And obviously it'll be anonymized and stuff like that, but I 100% agree. For a coach to come out and say, you know what, this is really stressful, or for a coach to come out and say the organisation they work for is causing them a great deal of stress.
No, that's different. Coaches do that every day.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's coaching. Coaching 101 is to blame the club. Yeah, absolutely. Coaching 101 is to blame the club. Coaching 102 is to blame the players. Yeah, you can't take responsibility for anything. I mean, you talked about Mourinho. Mourinho's whole career is complaining about the club and complaining about the players.
Yeah, and
that's why.
That goes into a theory that I'm really quite interested in. It's this idea of self-presentation theory. So it's people are going to present themselves in a way that protects their own ego and their own interest, based on societal norms.
Exactly.
And Mourinho's awesome at it. You see it a lot.
In this case, professional norms.
Right. Yeah.
The greatest pressure you have as a coach is to do the things that you're expected to do as a coach.
Yeah. And
admitting to weakness is not one of them. I've thought about this at a personal level. So if I say that if I'm under particular stress, if I say it anywhere outside my house, I wouldn't do it, because straight away I would think, damn, I'll lose the team, I'll lose the club, I'll lose everything.
So why is it acceptable for athletes to be able to do that and not coaches?
It's only acceptable. It has only been acceptable for a very short period of time, and is it really acceptable?
Well, you might be right. The last couple of years, I would say that there's all, and certainly in the UK, I'm basing this in the UK, there's all kinds of athletes coming out with mental health issues, and certainly on a public level, they get all kinds of support for it. I say you've got the situation where a few years ago, the two examples, Gary Speed, he's an ex-professional footballer, played for Leeds, he was coaching the Welsh national team, he hung himself. Yeah. And he's probably a victim of that. I can't show any weakness because I'll be ostracised and stuff like that. But then you've got an athlete, she was 18-year-old. She committed suicide on her 18th birthday. She was a British snowboarder, and she missed a flight to go to a training camp and thought that she'd let down her funders, GB Sport, or let down her teammates, let down her coach, and it was that stressful for her. She hung herself on her 18th birthday. And I can't on any level think that's acceptable for people to have to go alone with that and deal with that on their own, that they get to the stage where they think taking their life is the only way out. And this is part of the reason why, and I guess obviously a wee bit aware of the time, but the last bit of my research is sort of linked to coach education. So it's how do we educate and provide coaches with the tools if they don't want to publicly say, I'm struggling?
I think that's the end point.
And well, that's hopefully what my research.
There is a coach in France. There was this season who had time off to cope with a mental health issue and then came back during the season. So. And
how did that affect the?
That's all I know.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Fair enough.
That's really the thing that I would add is that the French league system, at least French coaches tend to be city employees or some have some version of public service contracts. So it might be a little bit different in practice than to do the same thing if you were in Italy or Poland or Russia or something.
And I guess this comes down to sort of cultural things as well, because this is really bad generalisation, but Eastern Bloc countries, Russia, Poland, I dare say the masculine guy is not going to talk about his feelings. It's very stoic and very, I do the job. I'm not interested in opening up about my feelings.
Yeah. The Europeans in general are really different to the Australians, so that I work with recently. But the Australians most of the Australian guys I work with are also really young, and they're the younger generation of Australians anyways they're really weird.
Can you expand on that?
Just the way they interact with each other and their environment is I mean, it's not weird at all, but apparently it's exactly how that generation reacts. You know, the relationships they have with each other and their environment. Was just weird to me. So.
Okay, I was going to say, is it just weird to you, or is it weird to the world in general?
Well, the Australian men's team is the most popular team in the world, more or less, because partly because of that. So it's weird and interesting to everybody. But,
And just on that, and I'm getting back to this Qatar game, that extravagance and the sort of emotion and the fun, the sense of fun didn't seem to be there in that game. Was there any
sure.
was there any reason for that or anything you could work out about that? Stress. And so it was the fact that it was the Olympics, yeah?
Yeah, it was a big moment, and so everyone was stressed, and that was
So it was kind of like a process
part of
breakdown.
the reason why I didn't want to add to the stress.
Yeah. We got 2 questions out. One from Milena. Can you give an example on when and why your players stressed you out? So just something that players might do or might have done that caused you lots of stress.
When the players stress me, I have to think about that. I don't really think of my players as stressing me, like the individual player. I can have an emotional outburst at a game situation or a reaction to a situation, but players in and of themselves don't stress me out. The relationships around it and the acting and showing and all of that stuff, they lead to build up of stress, but players by themselves don't stress me.
Yeah, I'd largely agree with that.
Unless I'm actually in an open conflict with one of them, that would be an example. So yeah, when I have had an ongoing conflict with a player, then yes, that's stressful.
Yeah, I think I think I largely agree with that. I think the stress will come from like day-to-day interactions with people where you disagree about something, or you don't think they're perhaps engaged and stuff like that. But I think it's pretty short term because you're invested in the people. You're invested in trying to make them as good as they can be. And generally speaking, most people that are on court are there to try and do the best they can do, right? Generally speaking. So I think
to kind of to Mark's point is it's not one thing. It's kind of more of a persistent situation where you have some sort of fundamental problem, an ongoing issue between yourself and the player. Not because of one thing that they did perhaps, but just, something isn't changing in the way that you want to see it change for one reason or another. Because you can normally deal with, okay, something happened, something's not right. And even if it's going on for a little while, you address it, hey, sometimes it's going to take a little while for things to get corrected. But if you don't see any actual progress toward whatever that is, I think that's probably where the stress starts to become the factor.
I would challenge that slightly from the point of view that is, again, that's maybe stress with a positive spin. It's then up to the coach to try and find the solution, and that's the challenge, rather than looking at it as a negative thing. Because, again, going back to that conversation with Lauren the other day, what works today might not work tomorrow. So it's a dynamic process. It's an ongoing process, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's stressful in a negative sense.
Agreed. She also asked me a question, but you guys can mix in here. Mark, probably not one that you're going to jump on. Maybe Simon a bit more. She wants to know about stress from parents and how to deal with that. For me, I honestly haven't had a lot of stress issues with parents, mostly because I think my philosophy of dealing with parents when I'm in those sorts of situations is different than a lot of other people seem to be. and that I actually engage them. I actively engage them that are part of my team, because for me, they're about a valuable resource in a lot of different ways. So in that engagement process, it's a two-way thing. I hear from them information that maybe I need, maybe I can use, and I can also give them information to keep them from getting in that little bubble that parents can get into, especially when it's just the parents all talking amongst themselves and kind of feeding off each other and going, blah, 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 in the crowd, in the stands or off to the side in the arena or whatever it is, and stirring the pot. And so if I'm being open and honest with them, the way hopefully I am with their players as well, about what their situation is, what the roles are, where we're trying to go, then it nips a lot of that parent stress in the bud as far as I'm concerned.
Well, from my point of view, I have an example where we had a real close win against a team. This is junior girls under 16, and we had a real close win in a game, and the girls were delighted. They were over the moon, and as I'm leaving the gym, parents are coming up to me and congratulating me and stuff like that, and a parent come up to me and thought she was going to say, "Good job, coach." And she started on me because her daughter never played as much as she thought she deserved. Now, fortunately, my team manager was there because he knew me quite well, and he just took me away and he dealt with it because I would have engaged all right, but it wouldn't have been on very friendly terms, I don't think. So that's my experience.
All right. We've got a question from John Bidiscombe, wondering how do you deal with player disappointment issues? This was specifically directed at Mark, but either you guys can take it.
How do you deal with them? In the moment, in whatever way, nobody likes not playing. Everybody wants to play. Explain the decision as best you can, and move on with it. That's really the only option. You can't let them play to make them feel better, and you can't. There's no other thing that you can give them to make up for it. So being as honest as I can, and upfront if I need to be upfront, and then go from there.
So I learned a long time ago. I did a sort of applied psychology course, and it was probably one of my favourite bits of advice is this: you have to change the setting, so you don't deal with upset players and whatever at the time in the gymnasium. You want them to get changed out of their playing gear, because then you're building another layer of distance between the emotion, and then typically you want to address it the next day rather than straight after the match. And I kind of try and do that as much as I can. It's really interesting in the UK, and you probably get it in the States as well and whatever, but straight after a Premier League match, the Sky Sports, they want to be there and interview the coach straight after the match to get an emotional immediate response. And the coach is always going to be a motive in that situation, as opposed to wait to the next day when they've had time to analyse things, think about things, take some of the emotion out of it, and they would give you a better and more thorough answer rather than just a soundbite that, doesn't offend anybody and doesn't actually give you any real insight. So I think time, change of venue and change of dress or a shower or whatever actually helps in that situation.
Okay.
Neutral venue.
Yeah, neutral venue. Rodrigo has a quote. I don't know where this comes from, but I thought it was interesting in the email. The coaches who seem to know their roles and when to focus on them are those who experience less stress, perhaps through having lesser levels of uncertainty and ambiguity surrounding their roles. Reaction.
I tend to agree with that. There's a thing, I'm just, if you bear with me a second, there's a where is it? I'm going the wrong way. There's a model. Here it's here. I can maybe share this with you later, John. But it's this idea of it's a demand control model. There's a guy called Karasek. He came up with this idea of people operate best in a strong, supported, high control, low demand organization. And I guess where you get weak support, low control, and high demands, you're then getting into a sort of danger area. And that's going to affect you adversely in your ability to be able to function and cope with stress and stressors.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the statement. If you rephrase it slightly to say that coach copes with stresses better, then perhaps. But all coaches have stress. I don't believe that. I don't believe that by and large there's a difference in the stress level between coaches. I think the difference is the coping mechanisms of the coach, and perhaps the support structures to some degree that may or may not be in place.
I understand what you're saying. I suspect what the quote is kind of getting at is, okay, to your point, we all have stress because we all have a common set of stressors that are generating stress. But to what degree are those stressors raising our, say, accumulated level of stress versus what our coping mechanisms are allowing us to then bring back down to a more manageable level?
So, sorry, Mark, just to interrupt. I need to challenge it slightly. Stress is highly individual and highly context specific. So what stresses you out might not stress me out. And to say it's a level we're all stressed by the same thing is simply not true.
Right.
Well, that's to the point I was just making. I think individually, certain things will cause higher or lower levels of stress for any individual. We may all have sources of stress that are coming at us from, relationships with players, relationships with management, relationships with spectators, family situation, health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At any given point, those will be greater or lesser sources of stress. But the degree to which any item causes more or less stress to the individual and how that relates to their ability in terms of the coping mechanisms to bring down the spikes or potential spikes, I think is kind of the idea of the quote, but maybe I'm completely wrong. All right, that's the last of the questions, unless anybody has anything else they want to throw in. Any kind of last bits you want to leave us with, Simon?
I guess that was just to sum up. I guess thanks for your time, guys. It was really informative and interesting. I guess the one thing that I never really touched on or talked about was this idea of ideas around how coach education could help coaches better deal with stress. And from your experiences, can coach education help, or is it just down to learning on the job what things are stressful and what things are not stressful?
There's a part of being of awareness can make a difference. I think that's always the case. And completely off the top of my head, my first thought might be that mentoring would be more helpful than coach education per se. But okay, mentoring is part of coach education, but more than courses necessarily. But I haven't had time to reflect on that. That's just the first thing that popped into my head. And last time what had popped into my head was wrong. So
No, I would tend to agree with it. And I think, unfortunately, we do have a problem in our sport, and maybe more broadly, where there's a lack of mentoring for a lot of coaches. It's something that I definitely wrote about when I was in England, and it certainly is not just a situation there where you get a lot of people who end up as coaches who don't have a lot of experience, don't have a lot of training. Somebody needed a warm body. Okay, you're going to coach. So you with not very much supervision, and certainly hardly any mentorship. If you happen to be in a situation where you can develop a career starting off as an assistant coach and progressing through, then yeah, hopefully, if you work with good head coaches, then you can get that mentorship to help you out with these sorts of things.
Awesome. I wholeheartedly agree. I think what we've got going on in the UK at the moment is this, with the bigger sports, they're using expertise from different sports. So maybe a football coach will go and work with a hockey coach, a rugby coach with a netball coach, and try and, have exchange of and crossover of ideas and stuff like that. And I think it maybe takes some of this, coaches want to protect their ideas and they don't want things getting stolen and stuff like that. And the fact that you work with other sports might sort of help eliminate some of that protective mentality. So I guess, I've really enjoyed that. Time's flown. So thanks very much, guys.